This episode contains discussion of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. The prosecution had spent weeks establishing what Peter Sutcliffe had done. Now, the trial turned towards the question it had not yet answered. How responsible was he for doing it? 4 psychiatrists had examined Sutcliffe. All 4 concluded that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Their medical opinions were unanimous. They believed that an abnormality of mind had substantially impaired his responsibility for the 13 killings. The conclusion was so significant that the Crown had initially been prepared to accept guilty pleas to manslaughter, rather than proceed with 13 contested charges of murder. But Mr Justice Boreham was not satisfied that agreement between lawyers and doctors should decide the outcome. After all, 13 women had lost their lives. The psychiatrist's conclusions depended substantially upon an account that Peter Sutcliffe had provided after his arrest. An account involving a grave, a voice he believed belonged to God, and a supposed divine mission to kill women involved in sex work. If that account was true, Sutcliffe might have been acting under a profound religious delusion. If it was false, then he might have deceived every doctor who had examined him. The diagnosis was medical, but responsibility was legal, and the final decision would belong to the jury. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history, and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles, Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper, Episode 17, The Defence Case. Peter Sutcliffe stood before the Central Criminal Court, charged with murdering 13 women and attempting to murder 7 more. He pleaded guilty to the 7 charges of attempted murder, but on each of the 13 murder charges he entered a plea of not guilty. In their place, Sutcliffe offered guilty pleas to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. This was not a claim of innocence. The defence was not suggesting that somebody else had killed the women. Sutcliffe had admitted that he was responsible for their deaths. Nor was he relying upon the legal defence of insanity. Instead, his lawyers argued that serious mental illness had substantially impaired his responsibility at the time of the killings. Under Section 2 of the Homicide Act 1957, as it existed at the time of Sutcliffe's trial, a person who killed another could be convicted of manslaughter rather than murder if they proved that they were suffering from what the law then called an abnormality of mind, which substantially impaired their mental responsibility for the killing. The language sounds technical, doesn't it? But the distinction is crucial. Diminished responsibility was a partial defence. If accepted, it would reduce murder to manslaughter. It would not result in an acquittal. It would not mean that no crime had been committed. And it would not mean that Sutcliffe could simply return home. A life sentence remained available following a conviction for manslaughter. The psychiatrist believed that whether Sutcliffe was convicted of murder or manslaughter, he should remain confined for the rest of his natural life. So the disagreement was not about whether he should be released. It was about how the law should understand his responsibility. Had Peter Sutcliffe murdered 13 women whilst remaining fully responsible for his actions? Or had paranoid schizophrenia substantially impaired that responsibility, making the appropriate verdict manslaughter? The medical evidence presented the prosecution with an extraordinary difficulty. 4 doctors had examined Sutcliffe. Their opinions concerning diminished responsibility were unanimous. 2 of those doctors had been instructed on behalf of the prosecution. Sir Michael Havers, the Attorney General leading the Crown's case. Considering the report alongside the Director of Public Prosecutions and Prosecuting Counsel, the Crown then spoke directly with the 2 doctors it had instructed. After considering the medical evidence, Havers decided that the pleas to manslaughter should be accepted. He would later explain that decision publicly. There were 3 principal reasons. First, all 4 doctors agreed that Sutcliffe's responsibility had been diminished. The prosecution had not found another psychiatrist prepared to contradict them. Second, a conviction for manslaughter would still allow the judge to impose a life sentence. All 4 doctors believed that Sutcliffe should remain in custody permanently, regardless of the legal name attached to the killings. And third, accepting the pleas would spare the victims' families from enduring days of further publicity, including repeated and detailed descriptions of the injuries inflicted upon these women. This was not the prosecution quietly abandoning the case, nor was it an agreement that Sutcliffe should receive a shorter sentence. It was a legal decision based upon unanimous medical evidence, the continued availability of life imprisonment, and the devastating impact a full trial could have upon families who had already endured years of grief and public scrutiny. But the Crown could not determine the outcome alone. The prosecution could indicate that it was willing to accept the pleas. The defence could invite the court to accept them. The doctors could explain why they believed Sutcliffe's responsibility had been impaired, but the court still had to be satisfied that accepting manslaughter was appropriate. And Mr Justice Boreham was not satisfied. Mr Justice Boreham required the prosecution to explain its reasoning in detail. Sir Michael Havers addressed the court for approximately 2 hours. The hearing was then interrupted by a lengthy adjournment before legal discussion continued. At the heart of Boreham's concern was a fundamental distinction. Doctors could diagnose mental illness, but they could not decide the verdict. Paranoid schizophrenia did not automatically amount to diminished responsibility. The existence of a psychiatric condition was a medical question. Whether that condition had substantially impaired Sutcliffe's responsibility for 13 separate killings was a legal question. And the doctor's conclusions relied heavily upon something the court had not yet tested: Peter Sutcliffe's own account. He claimed that he had heard the voice of God. He claimed that the voice had commanded him to kill women involved in sex work. And he claimed that each woman he murdered had been selected as part of a divine mission. But several of the women were not involved in sex work, were they? Sutcliffe had planned attacks, carried weapons, changed his methods, retreated when he feared discovery, concealed evidence, and continued living an outwardly ordinary life. None of those facts automatically disprove schizophrenia. A person experiencing psychosis may still be capable of planning. They may still be capable of going to work, driving, maintaining relationships, and conceal beliefs that appear profoundly detached from reality. But the practical decisions surrounding Sutcliffe's crimes raised questions that medical agreement alone could not answer. Did Peter Sutcliffe genuinely believe that God had commanded him? Did he genuinely believe that every woman he attacked belonged to the group he claimed he had been ordered to destroy? Or had he constructed the story after his arrest, knowing that it might change how the law judged him? Mr Justice Boreham refused to allow the proposed manslaughter pleas to settle the 13 killings. The issue would be placed before a jury. The 12 people sitting in number 1 court would hear the evidence, assess Sutcliffe's credibility, and decide whether the defence had proved diminished responsibility. The prosecution had been prepared to accept the medical consensus. Now it would have to test it. In most criminal trials, the prosecution carries the burden of proving the defendant's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. That principle had not disappeared. The Crown still had to prove the 13 charges of murder. But diminished responsibility worked differently. Because Sutcliffe admitted causing the deaths and relied upon a partial defence, the burden of establishing diminished responsibility rested upon him. The defence had to satisfy the jury on the balance of probabilities that an abnormality of the mind had substantially impaired his responsibility for each killing. That standard was lower than beyond reasonable doubt. It meant that the jury had to consider whether diminished responsibility was more likely than not. But the defence still had to establish it. A diagnosis alone was not enough. The jury had to connect the mental abnormality to the killings themselves. That connection deepened upon the alleged divine mission. If Sutcliffe had genuinely acted under a fixed delusional belief that God had commanded him to kill, then the psychiatrist could explain how paranoid schizophrenia had shaped his understanding and motivation. But if the jury rejected the account of the voice, or concluded that Sutcliffe knew the women did not fit the mission he described, then the relationship between his mental illness and the killings became far more difficult to establish. An individual may experience genuine mental illness and still give an untruthful account. A person may hold delusional beliefs, yet act deliberately in other parts of their life. Mental illness and calculation are not always opposites. The jury was not being asked to choose between a man who was entirely detached from reality and one who had never experienced psychiatric illness. They were being asked something much narrower and much harder. Whatever illness Peter Sutcliffe may have had it substantially impaired his responsibility when he killed each of those women? And to answer that question, the jury would need to hear from the doctors themselves. 3 psychiatrists would present the medical evidence upon which the defence relied. Dr. Hugo Milne, a consultant forensic psychiatrist who had examined Sutcliffe repeatedly. Dr. Malcolm McCulloch, the medical director of Park Lane Specialist Hospital in Liverpool, and Dr. Terence Kay, a consultant forensic psychiatrist whose work included examining prisoners at Leeds and Wakefield. Their professional experience was considerable. Their central diagnosis was shared, but agreement did not prevent their reasoning from being challenged. The jury would have to consider how the doctors had reached their conclusions, what evidence they had examined, how heavily they had relied upon Sutcliffe's own words, and what would remain of their opinions if the man they interviewed had deceived them. The first psychiatrist would spend more than 12 hours in the witness box. His evidence would introduce the jury to what he described as an illness hidden beneath an outwardly organised life. Dr. Hugo Milne was about to explain why he believed Peter Sutcliffe was, in his words, a classic schizophrenic. Dr. Hugo Milne had examined Peter Sutcliffe on 11 occasions. His task was not simply to ask whether Sutcliffe appeared unusual, or whether his crimes were so extreme that mental illness seemed inevitable. Terrible violence does not by itself prove that the person responsible was experiencing psychosis. Milne had to assess Sutcliffe clinically. He considered his behaviour, his reported experiences, the beliefs he claimed to hold, and the way those beliefs had supposedly developed. His conclusion was that Sutcliffe was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a serious and complex mental illness. It may affect the way a person thinks, interprets information, expresses emotion, and experiences reality. It can include hallucinations in which somebody hears, sees, or otherwise experiences something that other people do not. It can also include delusions, beliefs which remain firmly held despite evidence that they are untrue, or which cannot be explained by the person's cultural or religious background alone. Paranoid schizophrenia was the diagnostic language used during Sutcliffe's trial. Milne believed that the illness had existed for years, hidden beneath Sutcliffe's otherwise functional life. This was sometimes described as encapsulated paranoid schizophrenia. The word encapsulated suggested that the delusional system was contained within one part of Sutcliffe's thinking. Outside of that system, he could appear coherent, he could work, drive, marry, hold conversations, and complete ordinary tasks. But within it, according to the psychiatric evidence, he held beliefs which were profoundly detached from reality. This mattered because the prosecution could point to Sutcliffe's organisation as evidence of control. He selected locations. He carried weapons. He attempted to avoid detection and concealed what he had done. But Milne did not consider outward organisation incompatible with schizophrenia. A person did not need to appear confused at every moment, or lose the ability to function in every part of their life to experience a severe psychotic illness. The defence therefore asked the jury to look beyond Sutcliffe's calm presentation. His apparent normality, they argued, could coexist with a fixed delusional belief. At the centre of Milne's diagnosis was the account that Sutcliffe had given him. Sutcliffe claimed that the experience began while he was working as a gravedigger at Bingley Cemetery. He described hearing a voice near the grave of a Polish man named Bronisław Zapolski. Sutcliffe believed that the voice belonged to God. He claimed that it later commanded him to kill women involved in sex work. He also believed that his ability to continue attacking women without being caught demonstrated divine protection. Within this system of belief, ordinary events acquired extraordinary meaning. A voice became a message from God. A magazine article became a personal instruction. The failure of the police to catch him became evidence that a divine power was protecting him. And violence became, in Sutcliffe's mind, the fulfillment of a sacred mission that he had been given. Milne considered the experience at the grave particularly significant. He believed it represented a primary schizophrenic experience, a moment in which an ordinary perception was suddenly given an intensely personal, illogical, and unshakable meaning. Sutcliffe did not merely claim that he had misunderstood something somebody said. He believed that God had selected him personally, spoken directly to him, and placed him under a divine obligation to kill. Milne told the court that Sutcliffe showed numerous symptoms consistent with schizophrenia. He regarded him as intelligent, articulate, and capable of lying selectively. But being capable of lying did not necessarily mean that the central delusion was false. An individual experiencing psychosis can still conceal information, minimize behavior, or lie about other matters. Milne therefore had to distinguish between the lies Sutcliffe might tell for ordinary reasons and the beliefs he appeared to hold with genuine conviction. After examining him repeatedly, Milne concluded that Sutcliffe was not simply performing the role of a mentally ill man. He believed the schizophrenia was genuine, and he believed it had substantially impaired Sutcliffe's responsibility for the killings. Before we move further into any evidence, one distinction must remain absolutely clear. Most people living with schizophrenia are not violent. They are far more likely to experience stigma, vulnerability, social exclusion, or harm from other people than to commit serious violence themselves. Nothing in this episode should suggest that schizophrenia ordinarily produces crimes resembling those committed by Peter Sutcliffe. The trial concerned one individual, his particular history, the symptoms he reported, and whether those symptoms were genuinely connected to those particular killings. The diagnosis did not explain violence in every person with schizophrenia, nor could it by itself explain every action that Peter Sutcliffe had taken. And that was precisely why the medical evidence had to be tested. Milne's evidence was detailed. It was also vulnerable. The doctor could examine Sutcliffe, observe him, ask questions, compare his reported experiences with recognised symptoms, and apply his professional expertise. But he could not travel backwards in time. He had not observed Sutcliffe during the attacks. He had not been present at the cemetery. He had not heard the alleged voice. and he could not independently prove what Sutcliffe had believed when each woman was killed. The diagnosis therefore depended, at least in substantial part, upon the truth of what Sutcliffe had told him. This gave the prosecution a clear line of attack. What if the divine mission had been invented? What if Peter Sutcliffe had researched, imitated, or exaggerated symptoms? What if the supposed voice was a story created only after he understood that mental illness might reduce murder to manslaughter? And what if the women who did not fit his claimed mission revealed that he had never believed it at all? During cross-examination, Milne was forced to confront these possibilities. The last 6 women Sutcliffe had attacked were not involved in sex work. Yet Sutcliffe maintained that he believed every single one of them was. That claim was essential. If Sutcliffe knew that those women did not belong to the group he said God had commanded him to kill, then those attacks could not be explained by the mission as he described it. Milne accepted that the truth of Sutcliffe's account mattered enormously. He acknowledged the possibility that he could have been deceived, but after considering it, he maintained his diagnosis. The concession was important. Psychiatric expertise could explain whether Sutcliffe's reported experiences were consistent with schizophrenia, but it could not automatically establish that those experiences had actually occurred. The doctor could assess the account. The jury had to decide whether they believed the man giving it. The prosecution also examined the beginning of Sutcliffe's violence. Before the murders associated with the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, Sutcliffe had already attacked a woman in 1969. He struck her with a stone concealed inside a sock. According to Sutcliffe's later account, the alleged divine mission had not yet developed into a command to kill. The attack, therefore, raised a serious question. If violence against women existed before the supposed command, had the voice really caused the later crimes? Or had Sutcliffe attached a religious explanation to hostility which was already present? The first 2 killings also created difficulty. Milne was pressed on whether they could be understood as murder rather than manslaughter, because the relationship between the alleged voice and those early offences was not straightforward. His concessions did not mean that he withdrew the diagnosis of schizophrenia. They exposed a distinction running through the entire case. Peter Sutcliffe could have been mentally ill, without every act of violence necessarily being caused by that illness. For diminished responsibility to succeed, the defence needed more than a diagnosis. It needed to show that the abnormality of mind had substantially impaired his responsibility for each killing. Milne remained convinced that Sutcliffe was a paranoid schizophrenic. But the longer he remained in the witness box, the clearer the central weakness became. His medical conclusion depended upon the jury accepted the essential truth of Sutcliffe's story. The next psychiatrist called by the defence was Dr. Malcolm McCulloch. McCulloch was the medical director of Park Lane Special Hospital in Liverpool. He had interviewed Sutcliffe on 3 occasions at Armley Prison. McCulloch reached his diagnosis remarkably quickly. Within approximately half an hour of their first meeting, he believed that Sutcliffe was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. That did not mean that he ended the assessment after 30 minutes. He continued interviewing Sutcliffe, testing his initial impression and considering alternative explanations. But he believed that one particular feature had revealed the illness almost immediately: delusional perception. A delusional perception occurs when a real, ordinary event is suddenly given a false, highly personal, and unshakable meaning. The perception itself is real. The person may genuinely see an object, read an article, or hear words spoken. What becomes delusional is the meaning attached to it. McCulloch gave the jury an example. Sutcliffe had read a magazine article in which a priest described Manchester as a wicked place. Most readers might understand that as a general religious or moral observation. Sutcliffe believed it was a message intended specifically for him. He interpreted it as an instruction from God, telling him to travel to Manchester and kill a woman involved in sex work. The article was real. The private command Sutcliffe believed it contained was not. To McCulloch, the certainty and personal significance Sutcliffe attached to that ordinary material was evidence of psychosis. McCulloch also identified what psychiatry at the time described as first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia. These were a group of experiences historically regarded as particularly important when diagnosing the illness. They could include hearing voices, believing thoughts were being inserted, removed, or broadcast, and attaching delusional meaning to ordinary perceptions. Psychiatric understanding and diagnostic practice have continued to develop since 1981. These symptoms are no longer treated as uniquely conclusive proof of schizophrenia. But during Sutcliffe's trial, they carried considerable clinical importance. McCulloch eventually believed that Sutcliffe displayed several of them. He also said he had observed behaviour during the trial that appeared consistent with the illness. Sutcliffe sometimes looked upwards towards the area above the judge. McCulloch considered the movement consistent with somebody attempting to locate the source of a voice. But behaviour can be interpreted in more than one way. Looking toward a ceiling does not prove that somebody is hallucinating. If Sutcliffe knew that psychiatrists were observing him, the prosecution could argue that such behaviour might be deliberate. McCulloch saw clinical significance. The prosecution saw the possibility of performance. Once again, the jury would have to decide which interpretation was more convincing. McCulloch considered whether Sutcliffe's behaviour might be better explained by something other than schizophrenia. Could he have a personality disorder? Had the attacks been motivated by sadism? Had he experienced sexual pleasure from violence? Or was he simply an intelligent, manipulative man, attempting to escape convictions for murder? McCulloch said that he had considered a personality disorder involving sexual abnormality and sadism, but found insufficient evidence to support it. He did not identify a history which, in his opinion, established that Sutcliffe was a sadistic sexual killer. Nor did he believe that the available evidence displaced his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. He regarded Sutcliffe as extremely dangerous. Treatments might reduce some symptoms, but McCulloch did not believe it would necessarily make him safe. This was not evidence offered to secure Sutcliffe's freedom. The psychiatrists were describing somebody they believed required permanent confinement. but the legal route to that confinement still mattered. If schizophrenia had substantially impaired Sutcliffe's responsibility, the appropriate verdict would be manslaughter. If it had not, the verdict would remain murder. Under cross-examination, McCulloch faced the same fundamental challenge as Milne. How could he know that Sutcliffe had told him the truth? McCulloch accepted that Sutcliffe had probably deceived him about some matters. He could not claim that every word Sutcliffe spoke was reliable, but he did not believe that occasional lies destroyed the entire diagnosis. A person with schizophrenia does not become incapable of deception. The problem was more precise. What if the central story was the lie? What if there had been no voice, no divine command, and no genuine belief that the women were involved in sex work? The prosecution argued that McCulloch's conclusion depended substantially upon the account Sutcliffe had provided. Mr Justice Boreham then forced the issue into its clearest form. If Sutcliffe's account was untrue, what happened to the diagnosis? McCulloch accepted that the connection between the illness and the killings would collapse. He might still consider Sutcliffe schizophrenic, but if Sutcliffe knew the supposed admission was false or knew that the women were not involved in sex work, then schizophrenia could no longer explain those attacks through diminished responsibility. In that situation, McCulloch agreed the killings would be murder. That answer exposed the difference between two questions which could easily become blurred. Was Peter Sutcliffe suffering from schizophrenia? And did schizophrenia substantially impair his responsibility for these killings? McCulloch might answer yes to the first, even if Sutcliffe had lied about aspects of his crimes. But the second depended upon whether the divine mission was genuinely operating in his mind when he attacked. The diagnosis could survive. The defence might not. The final psychiatrist called was Dr. Terence Kay. Kay occupied an unusual position. He had originally been asked to examine Sutcliffe on behalf of the Crown. His task was therefore not to support a defence already decided upon. The prosecution needed its own psychiatric assessment. But Dr. Kay reached the same central conclusion. He believed that Sutcliffe was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. That agreement mattered enormously. The Crown had not merely accepted the opinions of doctors instructed by Sutcliffe's lawyers. Its own medical evidence pointed in the same direction. Yet Kay's certainty about the diagnosis existed alongside unease. His work regularly took him into prisons at Leeds and Wakefield. He knew prison staff, valued their observations, and understood that they saw defendants in circumstances very different from a formal psychiatric interview. Some officers believed that the doctors were all being fooled. They did not see a man controlled by psychosis. They saw a calculating prisoner who understood what he needed the psychiatrist to believe. And Dr. Kay could not simply ignore those warnings. A clinical interview provides one kind of evidence. Everyday observation provides another. A defendant may present differently to a doctor than to an officer, a spouse, a fellow prisoner, or a jury. Kay had to consider whether Sutcliffe's presentation was genuine or carefully manufactured. One reported conversation became particularly damaging. A prison officer described hearing Sutcliffe speak to his wife, Sonia. According to the officer, Sutcliffe suggested that if he should convince people he was mentally ill, he might spend around 10 years in a psychiatric institution, rather than approximately 30 years in prison. If accurately reported, that comment appeared devastating. It suggested that Sutcliffe understood the strategic value of appearing mentally ill and believing that deceiving doctors could reduce the time he spent confined. But the evidence was not quite as simple as it appeared. Sutcliffe disputed the meaning attributed to the conversation. The psychiatrist also had to consider whether an apparently incriminating remark could coexist with genuine schizophrenia. A person with a serious mental illness may still misunderstand sentencing, speak inconsistently, attempt to reassure a spouse, or make calculated statements. The remark did not medically prove that he was well, but it did give the prosecution something powerful: a possible motive to deceive. Dr. K remained convinced of the diagnosis, but he could not pretend that the evidence was comfortable. He recognised the possibility that if his diagnosis was wrong, the alternative was not a harmless man who had been misunderstood. It was a man simulating mental illness after committing calculated and sadistic killings. By the end of the psychiatric evidence, the jury had heard 3 experienced doctors reach the same diagnosis. Dr. Milne had examined Sutcliffe repeatedly and believed that the alleged voice formed part of a long-standing schizophrenic illness. Dr. McCulloch had identified what he regarded as several characteristic symptoms, including the delusional meaning Sutcliffe attached to ordinary events. And Dr. K originally engaged on behalf of the prosecution. He had independently concluded that Sutcliffe was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Their agreement was real. It could not simply be dismissed because their conclusions were difficult or unpopular. Later events would also demonstrate that questions concerning Sutcliffe's mental health did not disappear when the trial ended. But the jury could not decide the case using knowledge from the future. They had to judge the evidence available in Court Number 1 in 1981. And every medical opinion shared one critical dependency. Peter Sutcliffe's account had to be substantially true. The doctors had not witnessed the alleged experience at Bingley Cemetery. They could not independently hear the voice that he described. They could not enter his mind at the moment of each attack. And they could not prove that he had believed every woman was involved in sex work. If his account of the mission was genuine, the symptoms supported a diagnosis capable of substantially impairing his responsibility. If the account was fabricated, the medical link between schizophrenia and the killings could fail. The psychiatrists had taken the evidence as far as their expertise allowed. The remaining question was one of credibility. Did Peter Sutcliffe genuinely believe what he had told them? Or had he constructed a story capable of deceiving every doctor in the case? There was only one person who claimed to know the answer, and the defence was preparing to call him. Before that happened, the jury had to understand precisely what the psychiatric evidence could and could not decide. The doctors had not been called to determine whether Sutcliffe was guilty. They could diagnose illness, identify symptoms, and offer an opinion about the effect that that illness may have had upon his responsibility, but they could not deliver the verdict. That responsibility belonged entirely to the jury. And the distinction matters because all three psychiatrists who gave evidence agreed upon the central diagnosis. Yet agreement between experts does not remove the need for evidence to be tested. Psychiatry is not a window through which one person can look directly into another person's mind. A diagnosis is formed through clinical interviews, observed behaviour, medical knowledge, the person's history, and the account that they provide. In Sutcliffe's case, that account was inseparable from the diagnosis placed before the court. The psychiatrist believed that his story contained recognisable symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, but only if the story was substantially true. The jury therefore faced a task that no psychiatric qualification could complete for them. They had to assess Peter Sutcliffe's credibility. The case was not asking the jury to decide whether mental illness was real, nor was it asking them to choose between compassion for illness and justice for the women that Peter Sutcliffe had either hurt or killed. They could accept that Sutcliffe was suffering from schizophrenia, while still rejecting diminished responsibility. The legal question was narrower. Had that illness substantially impaired his responsibility at the time of each killing? The word substantially was important. The law did not require the defence to prove that Sutcliffe had completely lost contact with reality, nor did it require proof that he had been incapable of planning, understanding his physical actions, or attempting to avoid arrest. But the defence did have to establish more than the presence of an illness. It had to show that the abnormality of mind had seriously affected his mental responsibility for the killings. That required a connection between the diagnosis, the alleged delusion, and each woman he had murdered. If Sutcliffe genuinely believed that God had commanded him to kill women involved in sex work, then the defence could argue that the crimes had taken place within a fixed and profoundly disturbed understanding of reality. But if that belief had been invented, the connection disappeared. And even if the voice was genuine, another problem remained. Had Sutcliffe truly believed that every woman he attacked was involved in sex work? Or had the supposed admission become an explanation broad enough to include any woman he chose to attack? The psychiatrist could describe the illness. Only the evidence as a whole could establish its relationship to the crimes. This was why the prosecution's challenge had concentrated so heavily upon Sutcliffe's words. The voice had not been independently recorded. There was no disclosure made at the time of the alleged experience in Bingley Cemetery. No family member had been told that God had selected him. No priest had been approached, and no doctor had been asked for help. Sutcliffe's account of the divine mission emerged only after his arrest, when he already faced 13 charges of murder. The timing did not prove that the account was false. People experiencing psychosis may conceal their symptoms for years. They may fear ridicule, distrust doctors, or believe that a voice carries a private meaning which must not be shared. An apparently delayed disclosure can therefore be genuine. But the timing gave the jury a legitimate reason to examine the account carefully. So did Sutcliffe's behaviour. He had selected locations, carried weapons, used false number plates, hidden implements from police, stopped or retreated when discoveries seemed possible, and concealed his responsibility from the people closest to him. Those actions did not medically disprove schizophrenia, but they demonstrated an ability to make practical decisions, respond to danger, and protect himself from consequence. The defense would say that such organization existed alongside the delusion. The prosecution would say that it exposed choice, control, and calculation. Neither argument could be settled simply by repeating the diagnoses. The jury needed to hear from the man who claimed that the voice had governed his actions. Calling Peter Sutcliffe was an extraordinary risk. Until that moment, the defence could place his account before the jury through psychiatric evidence. The doctors could explain what he had told them, why they believed it, and how it supported their diagnosis. But once Peter Sutcliffe entered the witness box, the protection of the clinical interview would disappear. His own barrister would question him first. That process is known as examination in chief. James Chadwin would guide Sutcliffe through his account, but he could not simply provide the answers for him. Sutcliffe would have to describe the alleged experiences himself, where the voice began, why he believed it belonged to God, how he claimed it became a command, and why women who were not involved in sex work had nevertheless become his victims. And then, when Chadwin had finished, the prosecution would have the right to cross-examine. Sutcliffe could be confronted with every inconsistency, the violence which existed before the alleged mission, the delay before he mentioned the voice, the planning surrounding the attacks, the lies he told, the evidence he concealed, the statements he made after his arrest, and the women whose lives did not fit the story he had given to the psychiatrists. Calling him created an opportunity. It also exposed the entire defence to the possibility of collapse. If the jury believed Sutcliffe, his evidence could give human form to the symptoms the psychiatrist had described. They would no longer hear about the alleged delusion only through doctors. They would hear it from the man who had claimed to have experienced it. But if they thought he was lying, they could reject the foundation upon which the medical case had been built. The defence had presented 3 experienced psychiatrists. Now it would place their most important source of evidence directly before the jury. Number 1 court settled into silence. The jury had heard the medical language. Paranoid schizophrenia. Hallucination. Delusional perception. Abnormality of mind. Substantial impairment. They had heard experienced psychiatrists explain why Peter Sutcliffe's apparently ordinary life did not exclude serious mental illness. They had also heard those same doctors acknowledge the limits of their conclusion. If Sutcliffe had lied about the divine mission, their connection between schizophrenia and the killings could not stand. The medical evidence had brought the jury to the edge of the question. It could take them no further. For years, Sutcliffe had hidden his crimes from his wife, his colleagues, the police, and the communities in which he moved. Now he would be asked to reveal the explanation he claimed had existed inside his mind throughout them. The jury would see how he spoke, how he responded, whether his account remained consistent, and what happened when it was challenged. James Chadwin rose. He called Peter Sutcliffe to give evidence. Sutcliffe left the dock, crossed the courtroom, and entered the witness box. He took the oath, and then, for the very first time, the jury prepared to hear Peter Sutcliffe explain why he claimed 13 women had died. The psychiatric evidence had not simplified the trial, it had made it more difficult. 3 doctors had entered the witness box, and each had reached the same diagnosis. Their agreement could not responsibly be ignored, but neither could it replace the jury's judgment. A mental illness may be genuine, while an account given by the person experiencing it remains incomplete, inconsistent, or untrue. A person may hold delusional beliefs yet continue to make deliberate choices. And careful planning does not by itself prove the absence of psychosis. The law had asked 12 ordinary people to examine that uncertainty, not to decide whether mental illness deserved compassion, not to decide whether the crimes were horrifying, but to determine whether Peter Sutcliffe's illness had substantially impaired his responsibility for 13 separate killings. The doctors had explained what they believed, and now the jury would hear the story upon which that belief depended. In the next episode, Peter Sutcliffe gives evidence. He describes his work at Bingley Cemetery, a grave belonging to Bronislaw Sapolsky, and the voice he claimed belonged to God. He tells the jury how an apparent religious experience became a supposed instruction to kill. But his account will be forced to confront the violence which began before the alleged mission, the women who did not fit it, and the decisions he made whilst carrying it out. The psychiatrists believed that Peter Sutcliffe was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Now, the jury must decide whether they believe Peter Sutcliffe. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow so that you don't miss what comes next. And if you have a moment, leaving a rating on Spotify or Audible really does help more people discover my podcast. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.